Kia ora tātou, and welcome back after the break. Ko Phil Denham toko enwa. My name is Phil Denham. I've had the pleasure and privilege of helping organise this conference, and my role is as a Director in the Youth Justice System within Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is our final keynote speech, and someone I have a great pleasure and privilege to introduce, Judge Louis Bidois. Judge Bidois has been a judge of 19 years experience in the youth jurisdiction, and he currently holds the Komatua role, the leadership role for the National Rangatahi Courts. I've known the judge over a number of years, and I can attest to his passion for the positive role of culture in helping people gain their self-esteem, their identity, and their hope and optimism for the future. So I can, I'm introducing. So I can personally attest to Judge Bidois' commitment, having sat with him in many judicial liaison meetings, and also the power of the marae. For any of you who haven't had the privilege of being welcomed onto the marae via a porphyry, it's a spine-chilling experience to know that the weight of all the great things that have happened on those meeting grounds sits on your shoulder, encouraging you on to do good work. And I'm sure that every young person, every rangatahi who has the privilege of having their case dealt with on the Rangatahi Court is the better for the experience. So I'll hand you over now to Judge Bidois. Kia ora.
Kia ora hu mai tātou. Ki o koutou kua tae mai I tēnei wā whakahirihira kei te mihi ki o koutou. Ki ngā tangata tāwahi he mihi mai oha ki o koutou. Kua tae mai tātou ki te whakawhiti kōrero, ki te whakawhiti whakaro e pāna I tēnei kaupapa whakahirihira. E te rangatira e whau, tēnā koe mō tō mihi mai kei te mihi. Nō reira, ka nui rā ngā mihi ki o koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings to you all, especially those who are overseas. We've come together to share talk and thoughts concerning this important topic. So, to you all, greetings, greetings, greetings. The theme of this conference is delivering youth justice for the community by the community. That is aspirational and achievable, but it requires transformational change, a transformation of the fundamentals of our justice system. Why is there a need? What has brought this about? Fundamentally, when you have a justice system that is philosophically based on deterrence, denunciation, an eye for an eye view, all you're ever going to get or deliver is punitive-based outcomes. An approach that leads to imprisonment, hardship, resentment, anger, hatred, a lack of respect for the law and for the community that one lives in. A justice system should deliver fair, just and equitable outcomes for both the offender and the victim, but also the community. The New Zealand Court of Appeal in a case called Churchwood, the court recognised, firstly, age-related neurological differences between adults and young persons. Secondly, young persons are more vulnerable to negative influences. And thirdly, young persons are more impulsive than adults. And lastly, that the effect of imprisonment on young persons can be crushing, particularly long sentences. And it's for those sorts of reasons that we have specialist youth courts with designated judges, appointed lawyers, experienced stakeholders. And overarching the operation of the youth court is a different philosophical approach than what we see in the district court and in the high court. Despite that, youth courts around the world have generally failed to deliver justice for particular Indigenous people. New Zealand, despite best practices, having laudable objects and principles enshrined in its legislation. To some respects, we've also failed. That was principally the driving force behind the establishment of Ngā Kōti Rangatahi. That's a court process. I'm going to now play a short video and then provide a history and an explanation of how this come about, but also how it operates. A video, please.
If you want to reduce crime across the board, we need to have a court process that is culturally sensitive and recognises the people that come before it.
I tīmata mai e te kaupapa o te Kōti Rangatahi i Tūranganui Ākiwa. I te mea, te nui ngō ngā tamariki mokopuna kei te haramai ki mō i te arororo te kōti taioi i taua wā. Kāore i te mōhio o te reo. Kāore hoki i mōhio ko wai rātou no hea rātou. Koira te tino kaupapa ka noho moke moke. Rātou ko rātou whānau i te ao Māori.
The real challenge was how do we work better and provide a new model using the same legislation for our Māori rangatahi before the youth court.
The objection was, if we bring the system to the marae, we are inviting the legal system to invade the last bastion of what we call taha Māori. And the kuia who stood up turned the meeting, said to everyone there, e hika mā. The kaupapa is about the rangatahi. It's not about the mana of the marae, it's about the rangatahi. Bring them into the bosom of the marae so that they can feel what these marae have to offer. They can rongo te wairu o te marae.
Pōheri actually is quite calming for a lot of young people, I think. Just from the start of the day in Pōheri, everyone is on the same level, everyone comes in the same gate, and there is, I think, a really, really good opportunity for connections to be made. Young people talk to police officers, they talk to social workers in a different way than they would if they were in a normal youth court environment.
The marae has always been a haven. The marae has always been a sanctuary. Marae has always been a place to stand and talk.
Well, Te Kōti, they have a lot more support and they actually say a lot of things to you to encourage you to do better.
It made me feel like they actually wanted the best for me, and I felt like I had a lot of support. Made me feel loved. Didn't feel like I was going through this on my own.
With Te Kōti Rangatahi, once we get here, we're in the wharanui, the young people get that engagement with people who they've not met before, with komātua and the kuia that are present, and they actually listen.
I tell them they need to lift their eyes off the ground. You need to look out and see what's out there and then make your choices. The last time I saw this boy, I felt very proud for him because he kept looking up and he started to hold his head high.
I say to the young people when they come to court, if there's one thing you remember from your experience at the Rangatahi Court, I want you to take this with you for life. It is your pepeha, identity, tuakiri, and that starts with your mountain, your river, and your tribe. Ko wai koe no hea koe, nā te aha koe.
Ko rākau tapu tōku maina, ko ke ana tōku moana, ko Māori tōku waka, ko tapuai tōku awa.
The Pasifika Youth Courts came off the back of Ngā Kōti Rangatahi. It was always the intention that once that court was up and running for Māori young people, that we would have a similar model for Pasifika young people. It's been fascinating to see law, culture and faith in one process, and to see them leave the justice part behind and take with them the culture and faith.
I have seen some spectacular examples of successes in the Pacifica Youth Court, which I don't believe we would have achieved in the District Court Youth Court setting. We have to trust people that they will grow and develop, just like we as individuals think we have grown and developed. These young people are entitled to those same opportunities and have a right to expect us to go along and act ethically, professionally, with an open mind, but really importantly, I believe, with an open heart.
It's not a separate system, it's an adjusted system, part of the whole, and I would resist any suggestion that we're doing something separately. It's an adapted, it's a culturally adapted process.
The image of the scales clearly have been unbalanced for too long. And that the Māori effort to balance the scales of justice is starting to shine through.
It's always been said the Rangatahi Court is not a magic bullet, but it does what it does. It plays its part. And the most important part it plays is by transforming the face of a justice system to allow the Māori voice to be heard. It enhances respect for the rule of law when the law is speaking in the language of the people it is dealing with.
For me, working with a group of Māori judges who have become real colleagues and confidants, that's been inspiring for me. And to see their mahi, I think the country could be cautiously optimistic. And in one sense proud of what a group of committed and visionary judicial leaders have accomplished.
Powerful and deep expression of how justice can be delivered effectively for the community and by the community. All we want is to make our community safer, and with that, who are in the community, including our young people. So how did we get to Ngā Kōti Rangatahi? First question you might want to know, particularly if you live overseas, is what is a marae? Thank you. A marae is a venue that is central to the lives of Māori. And usually it comprises two buildings, a wharakai where we eat and have the ablution block, and the second one is a wharenui where we sleep. And the marae are used for all sorts of things, meetings, gatherings, milestones like birthdays, and tangi. That's when someone passes away. You can see on screen Tarimano marae, which is my marae. When I pass, I'll lie in that wharenui for a couple of days. My three friends will come and see, a few others might come and make sure that they've heard right that I've passed. But that's where people will gather to farewell me before I go to a nearby urapa and or cemetery and be buried next to my father and other whānau. And marae are usually established around villages, but we also have urban marae. Thank you. Thank you. One of the biggest problems that we're facing, thank you, is the disproportionate overrepresentation of Māori in the justice system. In New Zealand, Māori make up 15% of the population, but we're 52% of the prison population. And so on any description, that's disparate and disproportionate. It has been a trend that has been consistent for a long time. And there are two problems that I see. Firstly, if we maintain the current system, it will only get worse. Secondly, the Māori population is going up. And so there's going to be a correlating increase in the prison population. And the problem of disproportionality, it's unfairness, racism, hopelessness, and it creates and breeds a lack of respect, hopelessness, anger, and invariably more offending. And we all know that there are a myriad of reasons behind that, and you would have heard all about that over the last 2 days. But it all extensively started by, thank you, colonisation. That is the process of settling among and then controlling Indigenous people of a country. Māori have been living in Aotearoa or New Zealand since the 1300s, albeit it was discovered much earlier. Māori lived across the two islands, the North and South Island. They had their own values and systems. They had their own justice system. And things people didn't always live in harmony, but we did have structure and order, and the communities were able to live generally together. And then along came the British. Thank you. In terms of the background, Māori and the British signed a treaty in 1840. That was to provide some peace and order in the country. Unfortunately, our justice system was never going to work. The British system was introduced. The judicial processes were introduced. So what happened was you brought a system from the other side of the world and imposed it not only on the British settlers here, but also on the Māori. And they were a race where most didn't even speak English. Thank you. And so you have fundamentally, right from the start, you're going to get problems. And some of our other reasons for overrepresentation, as you can see, have been social, they've been cultural, and they've been systemic. And it's always had an influence on what's happened. So we ask, what progress have we made? Thank you. Over the years, there have been commissions of inquiry, we've had numerous reports, we've had government strategies, we have changes to legislation, new initiatives, but yet nothing materially has changed. And some of those reports, like Puao Te Atatu report from 1989, which is 40 years ago, made the same complaints that we see in recent reports about our justice system. And statistics have not changed. Thank you. Thank you. There has been some very good work. There have been some very good people who've been involved in trying to change how we do things. The bottom line for Māori is that our situation could have been worse, but the reality is it should have been better. What are the solutions? There is, as you saw in that video, notable. One side, new initiatives be promoted. And about 12, 13 years ago, there were probably only half a dozen Māori judges, and we formed a group called the Kaupapa Māori Group, and we were given the job of going out and looking at ways of how we could reduce Māori imprisonment, particularly in the district court. That was a huge undertaking, but we thought to ourselves, when you're dealing with adults, most of them have thought processes, are set in their ways, and it is difficult to change. So let's focus on the youth in the hope that we might be able to prevent many of them going on that pathway or down that pipeline of appearing in the youth court, going to youth court residence, graduating after they turn 7 in the district court, and inevitably and invariably to prison. Thank you. What does a New Zealand youth profile look like? There it is, male Māori, out of school, single parent, history of care and protection. Thank you. Health issues, substance abuse, mental health, disengaged from culture, low achievement, minimal contribution. And of course there are other factors. But I would guess that that is a similar profile for most Indigenous people around the world, where there is disproportionality. With that profile, the pipeline to jail would just continue. So the question we asked ourselves was, we turn the tap off. Thank you. We came up with the Ngā Kōti Rangatahi as a process. And you'll see on the PowerPoint what we call a whakatauki or saying, and it goes, he aha te mea nui, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. What is the most important thing in the world? It is people, it is people, it is people. And the youth of today are going to be our leaders of the future. And therefore we needed to do something to nurture them, love them, rebuild damaged lives, give them hope, and provide a future pathway where they would engage, have higher expectations, be confident in who they are, and try and achieve. Thank you. The Ngā Kōti Rangatahi vision was we had to make fundamental change as to how and where we did things. And so we decided to, instead of having the court at the court and bring in kaumātua, we would go to the marae. We would utilise kaumātua, who are elders, and Māori cultural processes as part of the court process in the hope that we could change these young persons' lives. Thank you. And what we wanted to achieve was get better family support coming to court. Usually it was only one parent. We wanted to get increased engagement. You could hardly get boo out of the kids when they sat in or stood in the courtroom. We wanted to get better compliance with our family group conference plans. We wanted to reduce the risk of reoffending and we wanted better victim outcomes. Thank you. And so we also used a provision in the law which had never been used for many, many years, and that was the use of lay advocates. These are appointed civilians who would do cultural reports on the young person, and it would report about what their connection or disconnection with their culture was. Thank you. And that was really, really important. The first Te Kōti was in 2008. That was presided over by Judge Taumanu, who was the lead Te Kōti Rangatahi judge back then. He's now the Chief District Court Judge of New Zealand. And so that's been a feather in his cap, and I also say our cap. And when the first sitting took place, it was a low-key event. It was judicially led initiative, therefore we got buy-in from the police and social welfare. It got off the ground reasonably easily because it was driven by judges and the community with iwi support. And we didn't have to go through a lot of the red tape that you normally would have to. And so what you had was the community coming together to deal with community issues. Thank you. In New Zealand now, we've got 16 Rangatahi Courts spread across the country. We need a few more, particularly one in Wellington, our capital, and another one in the South Island. The establishment is based on a number of criteria. For example, the need for a Te Kōti, the support for a Te Kōti, what resources are available in terms of marae and judge. Generally, you needed a high rate of Māori who were offending in that particular area. You needed support from community and stakeholders. And those resources were a marae, which would be close to the court, a marae that had a pool of kaumātua and a pool of workers because they were responsible for putting on things like kai, which I'll come to shortly. And for the judges, we decided that when we started the Te Kōti, only Māori judges would preside. Because when you're sitting in a Te Kōti, there are subtleties that only a Māori will pick up. And if anything went wrong with the Te Kōti process, we only wanted to blame ourselves. We didn't want to say, oh, was that Pākehā judge that mucked things up and ruined it, and we've had to scrap the whole thing. But that's since changed. That we have Pākehā judges who are doing Te Kōti around the country from time to time, particularly when we're low in resources. Thank you. All the Te Kōti now, when we have an opening, we have an official launch. That is an opportunity for all the stakeholders, government officials, local dignitaries, and the community to come together to recognise the launch of Te Kōti. It gives the Te Kōti status straight away, and it gets buy-in from the community. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's Te Kōti of Te Arawa, where I preside. No one came to the launch. Nah, that's two different marae in there. We had the launch at our main marae, Tamata Kapua, but the court itself is held at a different marae, Taharangi, because mainly they do not have tangi on that marae. It has social services connected to it, and so that was a better fit for Te Kōti. Thank you. That's 2 Taupo, and you see on the right 2 of our prominent Māori judges. Thank you. What are the underlying principles? Well, as you heard from Youth Court Judge Beecroft, it's the same law. No law change was required. We apply the same objects and principles under our legislation. The approach is the same. We're after accountability and identifying and dealing with the drivers of offending. Thank you. The biggest difference is we get more and better and deeper engagement because we have a better attendance of whānau. We've got stakeholders, we've got kaumātua, and we have more victims who come to the court, even though it's on the marae. And you look at different solutions as to how we can change these young people's lives. What's important is that all young people can attend. This is not a court just for Māori. I've had Pākehā at my court. I've had a Croatian, Pacifica people, a South American. The only criteria is that they do their pepeha, which I'll explain what that is shortly, and they comply with the cultural processes of the marae. And if they're prepared to do that, then they can come. They must consent to come to the court. Some of our stakeholders believe that Te Kōti is so empowering that it should be by default, and all Māori kids in particular should go there. But our response to that is this. If we force them there and they play up and they do not engage, they can turn around and say, we didn't want to come here, therefore it's your fault. And they'd be right. But by consenting to come, they are then agreeing that they're going to do their pepeha and they're going to comply with the cultural processes. And one of the striking features of the young people that appeared before us was how disconnected they were. And so we made it mandatory that they do a pepeha. My pepeha is ko nonga te maunga, ko awau te awa, ko te arawa te waka, ko rangiwewehi te iwi, ko tarimano te marae, ko Louis Bidois taku ingoa. It represents our cultural connectedness. You can take away my liberty, my rights, my clothes, my possession, but you can't take away my whakapapa or my heritage. And that applies to all Māori. And so the real focus of the court was trying to reconnect these young people to their culture. Because when we have culturally strong youths, they don't get into much trouble. Thank you. In terms of a process, when a young person accepts responsibility for offending in the mainstream court, their cases in New Zealand is adjourned for a family group conference. At the conference, the people in attendance will talk about the offending, propose the outcomes, but they'll also discuss where the case should be monitored, i.e. in the mainstream youth court or at Ngā Kōti Rangatahi. If it's the marae, then they go to Te Kōti. The judge approves an adjournment to the next sitting. If they want to remain in mainstream, then obviously that is their right. Some of the courts, Te Kōti, sit fortnightly, some sit monthly depending on numbers. Thank you. One of the advantages, obviously, is the cultural components of Rangatahi Court. Every Te Kōti operates on the same principles, but all are different. There are differences between the marae and the iwi that run the marae, but fundamentally, the day is the same up and down the country. Thank you. We start with a pōwhiri, which is a welcome. All the judge, the stakeholders, the young person, family, all meet at the gate. There is a karanga from a court that calls the group onto the marae. Call of reply. We go onto the marae and take our seats. Thank you. The hosts will speak, welcoming us, telling us what the purpose of the day is. Then they will sing a waiata or a song which supports their speech. And then someone from the visiting group will stand and reply there will be a waiata. Thank you. After the pōwhiri, Māori have a process called hongi, where the hosts or the visitors approach the host and press noses together. You may notice that if you speak to Māori, most of them generally have got flat noses, and that comes about because of the hongi. And it represents a sharing of breath, two people exchanging breath effectively. And then we have a kai. It might only be sandwiches and savouries and a cake, but that kai process or food process is really, really important. Firstly, it's the formal ending of the pōwhiri process. But what you find is that you have young people, their families sitting with police, with the judge, with kaumātua, with stakeholders, all sitting at the same table. And in an informal situation, we might talk about the All Blacks losing to Ireland. We won't talk about the cricket. We won't talk about, or they don't talk about world affairs, but they would certainly talk about something like COVID, or there's an opportunity for the lawyer to catch up on progress and what's been happening in someone's life. But it also breaks down that stereotyping. The police aren't the bad guys. These young people, they have got so much potential, and deep down, they're not bad people. But also by providing kai or food, it also nourishes our young people, and that's from a well-being perspective. And sometimes you watch them put 4 or 5 sandwiches and 3 or 4 savouries on their plate, you know that they're hungry, and they are welcome being fed. We then all go into the wharanui, or the meeting house, where the court begins. Thank you. Thank you. We start with a karakia or prayer, and then the marae hand over to the judge for the court to start. Can you just go back one, thanks? Oh. Yeah, thank you. The setup, they're all different. It depends on local preferences. This is a marae that I sit at. We have a U shape. The kaumātua sit with the judge. There are stakeholders around the table. The families sit in chairs just in front of the U-shaped tables. The kaumātua have a very important role. They ask questions of the whānau, they share experiences. I've been a judge for 18, 19 years, youth advocate previously for 20 years, and I've seen and heard things at Te Kōti which you'll never ever experience in mainstream youth court. It's hard to explain or convey those experiences in a presentation, but sometimes you get light bulb moments when a kaumātua was told a youth that he knew his grandfather who was in the 28th Māori Battalion and fought in World War II. The youth didn't know that. Eyes light up for the first time. He's got something to be proud of. I'm sometimes humbled by the wisdom of the kaumātua and what they're talking. We have victims who are more likely to attend Te Kōti than mainstream. At Wairaka Marae, we have a weaved mat, a whāriki, that symbolises victims. And one day we had a youth come forward and he placed his hand on this weaved mat and he apologised to it as if he was apologising to the victim. We had a driver of a vehicle, a young person charged with careless driving causing death. She killed her passenger. She sat next to the mother of the deceased, holding hands. The mother agreed for the young to put together an album from Facebook pages so that she would have this memory of her only child. And that's something that, you wouldn't think you'd ever see. A kaumātua, and you see at the back of that wharanui, all photos on the wall of people who've passed on. And they would point to a photo and say, that's your grandfather. And you have this young person, you could see the pride that they then gain. In the wharanui, we usually have carvings and what we call tuku panels, and at Wairaki you can see those patterns in the roof, rafters, that's called whaiwhai. They're just not patterns. Of the iwi and the knowledge that the elders have, they use those sorts of things to connect with the youth. And sometimes it just blows you away, and sometimes you just want to cry with the kōrero or the talk that has gone on. Thank you. It's a powerful experience. The elders at times growl them, encourage them. They give them challenges for the next time. Sometimes there is not in good engagement or compliance with their family good conference plans, and what the elders do through the judge is withdraw that young person's permission to attend to Kōti Rangatahi, and that person is adjourned back to the mainstream court. It's not an easy option, and in fact, it's way harder, but of course, it's the value that the process brings that is important. Cases are adjourned off for completion of tasks, or they're disposed of if they're completed. The judge makes the final decision on disposal, but takes into account the family group conference recommendations, compliance with the tasks that have been set, and significantly, the talk of the elders with the young person and their families. Thank you. An evaluation was undertaken a few years ago by an independent firm, and they concluded that it was a better process with more positive outcomes for the young person and the families and victims. And you see there's a note from an elder who says, we were all on the same level, therefore we all felt equal. Thank you. That's a note from a SIF supervisor who says you could see the relief, the pride, the self-esteem that goes up when a young person has done their PPR very well. Thank you. And there you've got a young person who's commented how they felt so much more connected having gone through that process. Thank you. And, you know, this was a compilation of some of the words that whānau and young persons and stakeholders expressed to the evaluating company. Things like better, feed, good, mean, positive, easier. Some of the features that came through. Thank you. Itself has had some successes, won some awards. Award for a couple of years ago, we won, thank you, an Excellence Award for Crown and Māori Relationships in New Zealand. Thank you. So what does the future hold? On the back of the Kōti Rangatahi, as you saw in that video, we have Pacifica Court. They operate on a similar basis. There are three, all operating out of Auckland. We have a Matariki Court, which is a similar type of court, but held on the court where we're dealing with adults. And you have kaumātua who will come to the court to support the adult who is in trouble. And those types of court have all springboarded off the back of Te Kōti Rangatahi. As I indicated earlier, we have a new Chief District Court Judge. He has a new vision that is called Te Ao Maorama, which is the world of light. And we're trying to develop in the District Court a new way of doing things, which is taking all the positives out of the specialist courts that we have in New Zealand, the Te Kōti Rangatahi, the drug court, Matariki court, the homeless court, the young adults court, and taking the best features of those things and trying to introduce them into the district court. And a lot of that has wraparound cultural processes to them. Easier English, formal language. It would start with a mihi by the judge, people to the court. In Ngā Kōti Rangatahi, used, translated, even though most of the police, the lawyers and stakeholder are Pākehā, they don't need to have what's been said translated into English, because you can actually get a feeling for what's being said by just listening, taking in what's been said. And so we have obviously come a long way in the last 10 to 12 years. Our evaluations show that there's a 15% reduction in reoffending because of the Te Kōti process. If you add in additional supports, and I'm sure that reduction number can be increased. What I say is the bean counters in Wellington look at reoffending rates and they deal and they judge the success of a process on that. But there are wider implications than just looking at reduced reoffending. 50% of victims in New Zealand are Māori. And so if you reduce youth offending by 15%, well, then you're going to have less Māori being victims. You have intangible effects like reduced offending within the family. Because these families know that they come to Rangatahi Court, there's a cultural report that's been prepared, that the elders are going to examine their lives, because most of these youths are a product of the society, but also their upbringing, and so they get tested. And it's a young person's girlfriend because he's seen his father assault his mother. And they don't want that, so they change their ways. I had anecdotally a family come up to me and so proud that they went through a Christmas New Year with no alcohol, which meant no fighting, which meant more money, because their boy had just been sent to a drug and alcohol rehab. He came home just before Christmas, and they didn't want to send him into the same environment in which he had lived and where he'd got his substance abuse. And so you had those sorts of changes. You have young people, the younger brother or sister no longer following in what would have been the older brother's footsteps, would have been into trouble and into court and later into prison. And so these are some of the ways that we've turned down the tap. We certainly haven't turned it off, but our future looks brighter because of this process. Believe me, it's hard work, but it's worth it. You get satisfaction from seeing positive results. And we have a whakatauki, you can see it on the bottom of the PowerPoint. Kua takato te manuka oe tuake rā. The challenge has been laid down, so rise up and accept the challenge. Thank you. I'm available to take some questions. I'll answer them if I can.
Thank you, Judge. I'll collate some questions as they come through. I'd just like to say a few words of acknowledgement, and first to acknowledge your leadership and continued leadership for the Te Kōti Rangatahi. Also acknowledge Judge Tamanu, who was the tip of the spear back in 2008.
Yes.
And it was heartening for me to see the former principal youth court judge, Andrew Breecroft, former children's commissioner, Andrew Brickhoft appearing the video and to hear his voice. It would have been a very strange youth justice conference to not hear his voice. He's happy fishing somewhere in Lake Tarawera, I'm sure, but it was good to see his mahi acknowledged, so I enjoyed that. A couple of questions.
One of the things, it's not a separate court, and people say, well, why focus on Māori? And the answer is, what's good for Māori is good for the community. And so if we can lift Māori performance, defending, then obviously we're going to have safer communities and better communities. And you know, you get this engagement by the community through the kaumātua and the stakeholders.
Absolutely, and something that isn't separate, but which lifts the wairua of the participants. One of the questions that was in my mind was, you mentioned that there's no need for some of the participants to know every word of te reo that's spoken, because some of the police, some of the youth advocates, some of our Oranga Tamariki staff will not be fluent. But what would you ask of those agencies to make sure that their staff were able and equipped to come onto the marae and participate fully? What would you ask of us?
The biggest thing is to get their pepeha right and the pronunciation of their own pepeha. I know it's nerve-wracking for them. It's nerve-wracking for me in front of kaumātua. I struggle. But the reality is it's important that they get the pronunciation and their mountain, their river, their waka, whether that's in New Zealand or Tainui or Te Arawa. Just get the pronunciation right. And that makes a big difference in the eyes of the kaumātua. And, you know, there are common words, the aroha, marae, that they'll know anyway. And they can be comfortable with it. And I've seen a commitment. I now know a Pākehā youth advocate who gives her children's names, her parents' names. It's helped them in their own development of their hereditary, you know, their roots and all that as well. And they've come to embrace it. And that's been so heartening, is to see that. And because of that, it's come about because they've seen the value in the process.
Okay. I was lucky enough to be in the presence of the Prime Minister when she was talking about the future of the adult justice system. And she said, Rangatahi Courts, Te Kōti Rangatahi, now they're great, we need more of that. So I know that at the very highest level in New Zealand, the success of the courts is being recognised. What more do you think we can do to power up the marae to help them better support the rangatahi and whānau who go through that process?
Well, some of the, you know, when we're trying to look to establish Te Kōti Rangatahi, a lot of the kaumātua will say, we just don't want to move the venue from the courthouse to the marae. It has to come with additional measures that strengthen the process. And wānanga, noho marae, where these young people can go to a marae for a weekend or a couple of nights, where they can get the feeling of being on a marae, sleeping there, learning their pepeha, learning a song or a haka, sharing kai, sharing preparation of food, and just being part of the skills that need to go on, the bonding and building relationships with people there. And the noho marae tikanga program for them would make a huge difference and would make a huge benefit to outcomes. And the ones that I've seen and attended have been great successes. Because, you know, when you feel better about your cultural connectedness, you're going to live a better life because you don't have all this baggage or, you know, it's reduced or it's not to the forefront of your thinking when you've got some pride in who you are. And that's what it's all about, instilling pride and self-esteem and trying to provide a new pathway for them.
Judge, you may not have seen it yesterday, but we had a presentation from some young fellas, they called themselves, from New South Wales, and one of them had been on the wrong pathway, but he went through New South Wales version of Te Kōti Rangatahi, which is the Kuri court, and he talked about the transformation that made, the reconnection to culture and the growth of self-esteem. You must have seen that transformation journey start in front of your eyes many times in the courts.
Oh, what gets me is that kaumātua can remember the pepeha that was delivered from a month ago when that young person appears the next time, and they comment on it. You're doing it much better, you're much stronger, you're more confident. Some will do a mihi as well, and you can see the pride. But what I also see is better attendance by whānau. When in the mainstream court, it's just the mother usually, and they don't want to be telling other family members that Johnny's been in trouble, he's got to go to court. But when they elect to go to the marae, they themselves are culturally disconnected, so they pull in a lot of their own family members to support them, and they've then got to do some work with our lay advocate person to build the pepeha for the young person to deliver. And as part of the process, we have whakawhanaungatanga, where they go around the room and everyone introduces themselves, and so they try and learn their own pepeha as well. And so that's one of the wider benefits of the court process. And it's important.
I was touched by something that you said about a rangatahi who suddenly realised that his grandfather was part of the Maori battalion, and that gave him something to be proud of. And I'm thinking about the intergenerational transfer of mana and how we all have a duty to take the mana from the past generations and grow it and pass it on to the next. And you can only do that if you understand your whakapapa and where you come from. So it's a really important part of the process.
And that was the astonishing thing. This young person had never been told by his parents or whānau or wider whānau that their koro or his koro had been in the Māori battalion. And, you know, they were legendary, something family should have been proud of, something they should have passed down. But that's a reflection of the dysfunctional upbringing a lot of these young persons experience and have. Something as important and as fundamental as that was not conveyed. And you could see it in his eyes. And, you know, it was great to see.
Judge, we come into the end of our time now. I'd like to thank you for the education you've given us today, the benefit of your wisdom and your experience. It's been a privilege to chair this session. I'm very grateful to you for coming along and doing that.
We're done this more than on a stage where you can be a bit more dramatic and a bit more theatrical, I suppose. But so be it. That's the life, the times we live in.
We are keeping each other safe by doing this, and that's the right thing to do, but it is a challenge, you're right. So we're now going into a video presentation for a few minutes, I think, and then after that we'll come back for the closing ceremony. So thanks everybody, and welcome you back after the presentation. Kia ora, Judge, thank you.
Thank you.